Hello, and welcome to Burns Banter, the podcast that takes a fresh look at the life and works of Robert Burns, hosted by myself, Alistair Turnbull. In last week's episode, we looked at the birth of Robert Burns. We looked at his mum and dad and how they influenced him. And we also looked at the place he lived in Ayr, in Alloway. Was he rich? Was he poor? You have to look at last week's episode to find out. In this week's episode, I'm going to talk about 4 different things. I'm going to talk about Robert's early education. I'm going to talk about a farm called Mount Oliphant, because they moved there when he was 7 years of age. I'm then going to talk about Robert's health at the time he was there. And then finally, we can get on to some poems, because he wrote his first poem at the age of 15. So let's dive straight in and look at his early education. Okay, so let's look at Robert's education. Now, I mentioned in last week's episode that his initial education was done by his father, William. His father, William, was an educated man, and he wanted to pass it on to his children. So he taught his son Robert and his son Gilbert how to read and write by reading to them from the Psalms and the Bible, and other passages of the Bible too. So when they were very young, they learned to read and write by reading the Bible with their father after they finished work during the day. William, their father, realised that he couldn't teach them everything. He had limited ways of teaching, so he sent them to school. So Robert went briefly to school in a school in Alloa in 1765. He was only about 6 years old at the time, and he didn't go for very long, only a couple of months. I don't think that William thought very much about the school. He didn't think it was that good. Because a couple of months later, William got together with some other farmers. I think it was another 4 farming families. And they decided to hire a tutor to teach all their children. Now, they would offer this tutor a meagre salary, and they would also offer him food and lodgings. So they would stay for a couple of months at one farm. The guy would then stay for a couple of months at the next farm, and the next after that. And that's what he was offered. And in return, he would teach their children. So Robert advertised for a tutor, and they eventually settled on a guy called John Murdoch. Now, John Murdoch was 18 years old when he was initially engaged by William to teach the children. He was educated at Ayr Academy. He was also a university graduate. They taught Robert's children and the other children of the other families at a small building quite close to the Clay Biggin in Alloway. And he taught them how to read. He taught them modern English. He taught them Latin, French, and mathematics as well. Now, Burns was reasonably good at French eventually. He was almost fluent, they said, in French. He struggled a bit in Latin, but he learned enough to read the classics. So English, Latin, French, and mathematics. They needed maths for basic day-to-day things. If you're going to run a farm, you need to know how much seed you're going to have to buy to fill a certain field and all the rest of it. You know, you need those basic skills just for everyday life. But the one thing extra that John Murdoch brought to the party was he had access to a lot of books. And John Murdoch then said, when he was interviewed later on, that Burns was an absolutely ferocious reader. He'd take a book and it would be finished, in a few days. He'd have to get another one and another one and another one. And he kept on going, and as I said, Murdoch had access to a lot of books, and Robert read a lot. When Robert was 7 years of age, they moved from the Clay Biggin, which is the house that they built in Alloway, up to a farm at Mount Oliphant. Robert and his brother Gilbert still went to John Murdoch to be taught, but it started to become a bit more irregular. They weren't there every day. And there was reasons for that, and I'll get on to that later on. So that was basically his formal education, was a little bit of schooling in Alloway, schooling from his dad, and a tutor, John Murdoch. After that, after he learned to read and write and learnt some Latin and learnt some French, he sort of basically became self-taught after that because of all his reading. And as I said, he was a ferocious reader and wanted to learn more and more and more. Let's now have a look at Mount Oliphant, the farm that they moved to. Right. Now, the Burns family did live in the old clay biggin, which is a two-room house that their father William built on a small piece of land in Alloway, but they left that behind and moved to a farm called Mount Oliphant. Now, Mount Oliphant was a farm just outside of Alloway, and it's on the Dunholm estate, which is owned by the Provost William Ferguson, whose Robert's father William had worked for Robert Ferguson for many years as a gardener. I think this helped him to get the lease on the farm. But when they got there, William's idea was he would sell the what is now called the clay biggin and the land they had in Alloway to put all the stuff he needed into the farm, to furnish the farm with livestock and seed and stuff. He couldn't sell the clay biggin. Nobody would buy it. It just wasn't happening. He thought his farm had come to an end before it had even started, until Provost William Ferguson, the guy that owned the farm, said, "Look, I'll give you a loan of £100 and you can stock the farm with £100 and you can give it back to me over time." So William said yes, and he did that. William Ferguson also charged them £40 a year rent for the farm, which is quite a lot, but doable. Unfortunately, as soon as they got there, they found that the soil was really poor. I mean, Gilbert Burns, Robert's closest brother, years later, Gilbert became a very good farmer, he managed a lot of estates, and he's known to have said later on that the soil at Mount Oliphant is amongst the poorest soil he'd ever seen anybody try to cultivate. So no matter what they did, how hard they worked, they couldn't get enough yield, they couldn't grow enough to pay back the rent and pay back the debt of the £100, and they had a really hard time at Mount Oliphant. Through a bit of bad luck and disease, William also lost a couple of his animals as well, and that's a big blow to a small farmer, to lose a couple of large animals. And they fell into arrears. They weren't doing particularly well. At one point, they couldn't even, in fact it was for about 2 years, they couldn't even afford to put meat on the table. No butcher meat at all was on the table. They ate the vegetables they grew. Now, I know that vegetarianism is a great lifestyle choice now, veganism or whatever, but they didn't know anything about a healthy diet, a balanced diet. They just ate the vegetables they had. And it had a profound effect on Robert, because the other reason he stopped going to school was because him and Gilbert became two of the main labourers. They had to work the farm all day. William, their father, couldn't let them go to school because he needed them to help on the farm. So their education stopped, and their working life began in earnest. Yeah, they were finding it difficult to keep up with the payments, but Provost William Ferguson, who Robert's father knew quite well, was quite good with them. He helped them through it, he let them away with some back payments, but they then paid them later on. Unfortunately, in 1773, he passed away. William Ferguson passed away, and the estate went to his son, a guy called James Ferguson. And as soon as his son got the land, he put the rents up straight away, massively. And he also engaged a factor, a guy to look after all of his estates. And he basically got the factor to try and screw as much money out of the Burns family as he could. And I think the modern term for it is to sweat your assets. You're trying to get as much out of your assets as possible. Because I'm pretty sure that James Ferguson himself was in debt, and he was trying to get as much money out of the estate as he could to pay his debts. Now that put a tremendous pressure on William Burns and Robert and Gilbert to try and up their work to cover the new expenses, the new higher rents, the quicker the repayments of the debt. And they just couldn't do it. And this guy, the factor for James Ferguson, kept on sending him threatening letters. Really bad threat. You must pay, or you are getting thrown out onto the streets and all the rest of it. And it caused them immense amounts of stress. His father was really stressed. They were all stressed. They would be in tears when they read the letters from this factor. So hard work and mental stress and very little reward is what they were getting out of Mount Oliphant. Which brings me on to Robert's health. Let's look at that next. Okay, Robert's health. Well, he is one of the main labourers alongside his brother Gilbert on the farm, and his father as well. They've not got a good diet, as I said earlier. It's mainly vegetables, and they don't know anything about a balanced diet. That had never been heard of back then. It's just you ate what you could afford to eat, and they weren't eating the right things, which was leaving them weak and susceptible to illness, because they were doing hard manual labour. There's no farm machinery back then. Robert actually developed a stoop from being in the plough so long, because back then when you were ploughing a field, it was a horse in front of you, one plough, and you were strapped to the back of the plough, and he would spend hours and hours every day during the ploughing season trying to plough fields, and when he's not getting enough protein, enough calcium, his bones weren't that great, and because you're stooped forward all the time for the plough, he actually developed a stoop that he kept from the rest of his life. I mean, he wasn't bent over or anything, but it was a noticeable stoop that he had from the time he had it at Mount Oliphant. As well as that physical effect, he also was diagnosed with a thing called nervous depression, which people think nowadays is a combination of physical exhaustion and mental stress, because they're working as hard as they can. They're trying to keep up with the payments. They're getting all these letters. They're being threatened with eviction. He's physically doing as much as he possibly can every day. You're just going to be exhausted. You're going to be wrung out doing that day after day after day. And at that time at Mount Oliphant, he was growing up at the time. He only went there when he was 7. He was there for I think until he was about 19 or something. All his formative years were there, and they were all very difficult. And it left a long-lasting effect on his health in years to come. But it couldn't all have been bad. There must have been some good times there. You have to relieve the stress somehow. And at the time at Mount Oliphant, their family grew. His mum and dad had 3 more children, so they were: William Burns was born on the 30th of July 1767. 2 years later, on the 10th of July, John Burns was born, and then on the 27th of July 1771, Isabella Burns was born as well. So Robert is now the eldest of 7 children on a farm that him and his brothers are trying to work, and they're not doing particularly well. So what do you do to relieve the stress? Well, one of the things Robert did was write. So let's now, thankfully, get on to some poetry and look at that next. Okay, they've been at Mount Oliphant for a number of years. Robert is now 15 years of age, and it's the summer. And they're having to bring in the harvest, which again is hard manual labour. But the practice back then was to pair a young man with a young woman, because the young man would have to take the scythe and cut down the corn or the hay or whatever it is they're bringing in, and the young woman would tie it into bundles. And Robert was paired with a girl called Nellie Kilpatrick. She was the daughter of a local mill owners, and she was there to tie up the bundles of corn. And Robert found that he was quite attracted to her, and he heard her singing a song. And it wasn't a song that he knew. And he asked Nellie about it. He says, what song was that you're singing? And she said, oh, the local laird's son had written it about a maid that he'd fallen in love with in his father's house. And she loved the song and the tune. And Robert thought to himself, well, if the local laird's son can write a poem or a song, I'm sure I could. And if I wrote a song about Nellie, maybe she would notice me. Maybe that would introduce myself to her. Because he's a 15-year-old boy at the time. He doesn't know how to talk to girls. He doesn't know how to attract them, get their attention. So his way of getting Nellie's attention was to write a poem. And he wrote a poem. And it's called Handsome Nell. And I will read it to you right now. Handsome Nell, written by Robert in 1774. Once I loved a bonny lass, aye, and I love her still, and whilst that virtue warms my breast, I love my handsome Nell. As bonny lasses I have seen, and mony fool's braw, but for a modest graceful mien, the like I never saw. A bonny lass, I will confess, is pleasant to the ee, but without some better qualities, she is no a lass for me. But Nelly's looks are blithe and sweet, and what is best of all, her reputation is complete, and fair without a flaw. She dresses aye sae clean and neat, both decent and genteel, and there's something in her gait gars ony dress look weel. A gaudy dress and gentle air may slightly touch the heart, but it's innocence and modesty that polishes the dart. 'Tis this in Nelly pleases me, 'tis this enchants my soul, for absolutely in my breast she reigns without control. Robert Burns' first poem, age 15, while struggling and toiling in the fields. That's what he's come up with. I think it's excellent for that. And Nelly did like it. I think they had a relationship, but I'm not sure. He did write other poems as well when he was in Mount Oliphant when he was younger. He wrote one, his next one was called, I think, Now Westland Winds, which is a poem about nature. And of course it's a poem about nature. He works with nature every day. He's a farmer. He hasn't been into any towns. He can't write a poem about towns because he doesn't know anything about towns yet. And it's a nature poem, that one. And then one other one he wrote at Mount Oliphant was called I Dreamed I Lay, which is one of the first poems he conveys a lot of emotion in. He's quite reflective, quite melancholy about the nature and how it affects him. You know, if you get a chance to read them, they're very good. But I think we'll leave the episode there because we've looked at how Robert's grown up a bit. He started to write poetry. He did it basically to introduce himself to a girl. That was his kick-off. That's the reason he did it. And his health is still struggling a bit. So, Robert's not in a great place just now. He's still at Mount Oliphant. He's still working hard. They're in debt. They're struggling. He started to write poetry though. He started to find a voice for himself, a release after all this hard work during the day. He's also starting to use it as an introduction to girls, which is a great incentive for a teenage boy. So we'll see how he does in future. I hope to see you in the next episode of Burns Banter, where we'll take it from where we've just left off. But until then, Slán Java.